He stood there holding a sword. Not a movie prop. Not a replica. The actual blade from Conan the Barbarian, forged for a film, carried for decades, and pulled out on a Sunday afternoon to say something that needed to be said clearly, by someone who had earned the right to say it. What came next stopped people cold. Not because it was angry, because it was exact. The video ran 7.5 minutes. It was not produced in a studio, not polished by a communications team, or filtered through a public relations layer designed to smooth out anything too sharp or too honest. It was a man in a room, speaking directly into a camera, holding a piece of steel, drawing on a specific kind of memory that most people in American public life do not have access to and cannot borrow. Arnold Schwarzenegger grew up in Austria in the shadow of what happens when democracy fails. He grew up around men who had participated in something monstrous and spent the rest of their lives either drinking the memory away or pretending it had never been their hands on the machinery. He understood from childhood what the morning after looks like when a country discovers what it allowed to happen. So when he picked up that sword and looked into the camera, he was not performing concerned. He was describing a pattern he recognized from a very specific and personal angle. Our democracy is like the steel of this sword, he said. The more it is tempered, the stronger it becomes. Our democracy has been tempered by wars, injustices, and insurrections. I believe, as shaken as we are by the events of recent days, we will come out stronger, because we now understand what can be lost. That last phrase, because we now understand what can be lost, not a rallying cry, a warning. The specific kind of warning that only carries weight when the person delivering it has actually seen the alternative. The backstory between Schwarzenegger and Trump is not complicated once you understand what drives it. It started with a television show. Trump left The Apprentice. Arnold took the hosting chair. The ratings declined. And Trump, who had retained his executive producer credit and whose name remained attached to the program, did what he does with any outcome that does not match his preferred narrative. He assigned the failure to someone else and made the reassignment public, at a national prayer breakfast, in front of cameras, in front of a room full of people who had gathered to discuss peace, healing, and service. I want to just pray for Arnold if we can, for those ratings. Not a critique, not a policy disagreement, a prayer for television ratings, delivered at a religious gathering by the sitting President of the United States. The audience laughed. Some nervously, some because they genuinely found it funny. Schwarzenegger found it funny too, briefly, and for specific reasons. He addressed it directly, without the performance of outrage that Trump had been expecting. I have thick skin. This doesn't bother me. Then he did what thick skin actually allows you to do. He corrected the record without flinching. The ratings had not failed because of Arnold. They had failed because 1/3 of the audience had actively boycotted the program after Trump remained listed as executive producer. Advertisers had departed for the same reason. The audience that left was not leaving because of who replaced Trump in the hosting chair. They were leaving because whose name was still on the credits. If you had just not opened your mouth and told everyone you were the executive producer, we would have had great ratings. They hate the guy, so they left. And I was caught in the middle. 1/3 of a national television audience, voting with the remote, making Trump's toxicity measurable in the specific language of ratings data, the very language Trump understood best and least wanted applied to himself. Schwarzenegger did not raise his voice while delivering any of this. He stated it the way you state arithmetic. The calculation was simple. The conclusion was not his interpretation. It was the audience's behavior, documented in the numbers. But the Apprentice argument was always the smaller thing. The larger thing was the question of what Schwarzenegger was willing to say about the man, publicly, with his name attached, without softening it through the usual political hedging that turns real observation into careful non-statement. President Trump sought to overturn the results of an election, a fair election. He sought a coup by misleading people with lies. He did not call it alleged. He did not frame it as one interpretation among several competing interpretations. He named it the way a man names a thing he has seen before, in a different country, in a different era, and recognized. My father and our neighbors were misled by lies, and I know where such lies lead. President Trump is a failed leader. He will go down in history as the worst president ever. Then, in the specific sentence that separated his assessment from every other political critique delivered by every other public figure during that same period. The good thing is that he will soon be as irrelevant as an old tweet. Not a threat, not a legal argument, a prediction, delivered with the calm of someone who has watched strong men build their empires and watched those empires dissolve, and who understands that the dissolution is not an outcome that can be prevented by posting louder or threatening more aggressively. When the conversation turned to immigration, to the decades-long cycle of promise and paralysis that had consumed congressional sessions and campaign cycles without producing anything resembling a durable solution, Schwarzenegger did not position himself on one side of the argument. He positioned himself above it, in the specific way that only someone who has genuinely left the arena can. For nearly 4 decades, we have had comprehensive immigration reform as a political issue. But the Democrats and Republicans both have no interest in solving this problem. They use it to raise money. A pause. The kind of speaker uses when what follows is the actual point. They keep pointing fingers at each other, and then they are surprised when we use our middle finger on them. He spread his hands, not angry, exhausted. The specific fatigue of someone who has watched a deliberate failure operate as a feature rather than a bug for long enough to have given up on pretending it is an accident. Then he described the political symbols, the donkey, the elephant. A donkey is a jackass, and wherever the big animal goes, it leaves a pile. That was not a punchline, that was a summary. 2 parties, 2 symbols, 2 animals that between them captured Arnold Schwarzenegger's assessment of the system that had produced the current moment. Not with fury, but with the bone-deep weariness of someone who had spent years inside that system and emerged on the other side with nothing more generous to say about it than that. The weight question arrived almost as a digression, an interviewer noting the shared apprentice history, the documented disagreements, and then the specific curious detail. The official record listing Trump's weight at 215 pounds, Arnold Schwarzenegger, former professional bodybuilder. The man who spent decades understanding human physiology at a level that the rest of us cannot access. The man for whom the assessment of a body's condition is not an opinion but a reading of data. He considered the question. "Run around yourself 3 times, he said. "You'll be in great shape." A beat. Is it possible he weighs 215 pounds? Yes, as much as it's possible. There is no climate change. As much as it's possible, we don't need to reduce pollution. The interviewer and the audience took a moment to absorb the full architecture of the sentence. He had not simply said the number was wrong. He had placed the number inside a category populated specifically by claims that contradict observable reality, claims that require the dismissal of evidence, claims that are made not because the speaker believes them, but because acknowledging the truth would require acknowledging something uncomfortable. If you lie about something as immediate and visible as your own body, something anyone with functioning eyes can assess in 10 seconds, the question that follows is not whether you are willing to lie about larger things. It is whether you are capable of distinguishing truth from the version of events that serves you at any given moment. Arnold did not make that argument explicitly. He just placed the weight claim in the correct company and let the logic do what logic does. Then someone asked him about California, about the threats to withhold federal funding, about the specific pressure being applied to a state that contributes significantly more to the federal treasury than it receives in return, about whether the suggestions circulating at the political edges, simply stopping the outflow of state money to federal coffers, were realistic as a response. Schwarzenegger shook his head, not because the frustration wasn't legitimate, but because he had been in government. He knew where the actual levers were and where the theatrical ones were. He knew the difference between a move that changes something and a move that performs changing something for the benefit of the people watching. Every individual in California pays state tax, local tax, and federal tax. How are you going to stop them from paying federal tax? The FBI comes after you. He let that sit. This is all dialogue. This is rhetoric. The left is going after the right going after the left. He was not defending either side. He was diagnosing the performance, the specific cycle of escalating language that produces the feeling of conflict while the actual problem continues unchanged underneath it. The question of how to contextualize the current moment, where to place it in the longer arc of American history, is one that tends to produce either panic or dismissal. Very few people navigate the space between those two reactions with any accuracy. Schwarzenegger is one of them, because he has a data point that most people born here do not have. He came to America in 1968, the year Martin Luther King was assassinated, the year Robert Kennedy was assassinated, the year the protests against Vietnam erupted across every campus and the streets of Chicago during the Democratic Convention, the year that, from the outside, looked like a country in the process of destroying itself. People always say to me, "Oh my God, what's going on in America right now?" And I say, relax. I came here in 1968, where it was a disaster, and we got out of that mess. So America will always get out of this mess. Believe me, this will be solved. Not the optimism of someone who has never seen anything go badly. The specific confidence of someone who arrived during a crisis, watched the country survive it, and chose to stay. chose to become part of it, chose it deliberately as an adult, with full information about what it was and what it was capable of. That is the voice that cuts through. Not the person born into citizenship, who never had to choose it, who takes it as a given, and therefore sometimes fails to understand what it actually costs. The person who crossed an ocean, rebuilt themselves in a new language, and earned every piece of the life that followed, and who looked at the same moment everyone else was panicking about and said, "I've seen worse, we'll make it." Trump called him a failure, blamed him for the ratings he had engineered, prayed for his television numbers in a room full of clergy. Arnold called him the worst president in American history, named his attempt to stay in power a coup, described his tactics as the same tactics that broke countries Arnold had grown up in the ruins of. And then he picked up a sword, not to threaten, not to perform, to make a point that could not be made as precisely as any other way. The steel that comes out of the forge is not finished. It needs to be heated and cooled and beaten and heated again. Each cycle of pressure does not weaken it. Each cycle of pressure is what makes it what it is. The more it is tempered, the stronger it becomes. That sentence was not written for this moment. It was written for every moment that looks like this one. Every period when the system gets tested in a way that makes the people inside it question whether it is strong enough to survive the test. Arnold had seen what happens when systems fail. He knew what the failure looked like from the inside. He had grown up in the aftermath, and he was telling the country, this is not that. This is the tempering process. This is the fire and the cold water and the hammer. This is the thing that is making it stronger. Whether that turns out to be true will be written in the years and decades that follow. But the person with the clearest view of the stakes is probably the one who did not take the thing for granted. Who chose it? Who crossed the ocean and stayed? Trump will have his legacy assigned by history with or without his input, in the specific language of documented fact rather than campaign posting. Arnold already has his, built over decades, in bodybuilding, in film, in the governor's office, and in a 7.5-minute video on a Sunday afternoon in January, holding a sword in both hands, speaking to a country that needed someone to say plainly what he had understood since childhood. Democracy is not fragile. It is steel, and every time someone tries to break it, they are only adding to what it can withstand. Subscribe if you believe that the most powerful thing in American politics right now might be the voice of someone who chose this country and has never stopped choosing it.